Good evening. I'm Dr. Robert E. Braylock from BHK Consulting, and thank you for joining us for part 2 of BHK Consulting Presents Race and Education. Thank you for those of you who joined us for part 1. For those of you who did not, in part 1 of Race and Education, we kind of examined some of the historical narratives surrounding race and education. And so whether it was specific policies that are making it more prevalent for Black and Brown students to be suspended, or whether we're looking at retention rates and graduation rates within colleges and universities, there has historically been for many centuries inequities and injustices within education for students of color. So in part 2 of Race and Education, we will be looking at strategies and practices that are working within education to try to eliminate these inequities and injustices for students of color. But before we get started, we will have our panelists provide introductions.
Hello, good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever everyone is. Happy to see everyone again. Thanks for having us back. I'm Dr. Evandra Catherine. I work as a postdoc looking at early childhood development, birth to 8, particularly Black boys. I'm a mother of a child with a disability who's also gifted, twice exceptional. I'm really policy minded. I've been an educator now for quite some time, and I'm just really excited to be part of the show.
Thank you for joining us.
Hello, my name is Karen Winston Carpenter. I'm an educator with the East Cleveland City Schools District. I served as a gifted intervention specialist for 19 years, and this is my 20th year, and I will start a new role as an instructional coach. I have my master's in curriculum instruction. My bachelor's degree is in grades 1 through 8 elementary education, and I'm glad to be here, part of the second showing.
Thank you.
Mucho gusto. My name is Michael Alonso. I'm a 8th grade English and reading teacher at Buckeye Central Middle School. I am a native Southern Californian living in Ohio. I am the oldest of 6 kids, and this is my 3rd year of teaching. I was a non-traditional student, graduated from Bowling Green State University, and I am excited to be here to help with this discussion.
Thank you.
Hey, good evening, everyone. My name is Brandon Gaddy. Excuse me. I am currently serve as the Director of TRIO Student Support Services here at Owens Community College in Toledo, Ohio. I am a student affairs practitioner. I've been in student affairs now going into my 16th year, and I'm glad to be here with you all.
Thank you for joining us today, Gaddy. Appreciate it. So I got hip to Nate Bowling. I don't know if any of you all follow him on social media or his blog, but Nate Bowling is a Black teacher who I would say gained more collective notoriety a few years ago. He was selected as the Teacher of the Year in Washington State, but more recently, I think it was kind of towards it might have been this past summer 2019. He recently relocated to Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates to teach there. And so he has really inspired me, one, as an educator, but two, as a diversity and inclusion and equity and justice practitioner as well, with some of the work that he's done, increasing the pass rate on AP exams for his students of color that he's taught, but also increasing their enrollment in AP classes in high school and things like that. And so who are some of the people that you all look up to as educators?
For me, as I was learning, how to teach and stuff, I came across Marva Collins's methods of teaching, and man, she taught in a classical manner, using Socratic dialogue a lot, which is what my high school teacher used a lot, and I was like, oh, okay. And she actually started the West Side Preparatory School in Chicago to help for her, like the disadvantaged kids that were in the Chicago area who were not passing classes and stuff. So she was like, well, if I'm not going to make a difference in this school, I'm going to start the school. So she started a school very small, and then it blew up and got really, really big. Had a movie made about her, but like just her books and her methodology of teaching, and really getting to scoop down into where a student's at to get them to rise up to where they can be and seeing their potential really had a big influence on me as I was shaping what was going to be my philosophy of teaching. Same with Fred Rogers, like Mr. Rogers. I was abused as a kid, and I remember it just being kind of developmentally challenged when I was younger, and not being able to tie my shoes until I was like not three, in third grade. So one day I was just home because I didn't want to get bullied because I was the only kid that couldn't tie his shoes in the third grade. And I remember watching the program, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and he comes in, he sings his song, and I don't even know why that channel was on. I didn't watch the dude or anything like that, but just very gently, he just spoke, "Hey, do you know how to tie your shoes?" I felt like, is he talking to me? And so he very gently was talking about how it's just the process of understanding who you are and what you're doing, as he was showing me how to tie my shoes, because my mother was left-handed, my uncle was left-handed, and they weren't showing me how to do it right, and I couldn't process it. But watching him gently talk me through the steps, instead of yelling at me and screaming at me, it made an impact on me. Is that if I want to be a teacher, I want to speak that way to my students. I don't want to be in their face. I don't want to berate them because they're not achieving what they're supposed to be achieving. I want to be able to speak to them gently and go, "Hey man, let's see what we can do together," right? It needs to be a journey together. Another person who's been really influential on me is actually Kimberly Kelly, she's a few years younger than me, and she's an educator. I think she just left the South Central school district down there in South Central Los Angeles. She was the only other white teacher at an all black school, or mostly Hispanic school, and she taught human geography and was teaching these kids that they can be much more than what people tell them to be. And especially in that area of Los Angeles, man, there's not a very high rate of college like applicants. So she was helping those students to like get out of the poverty that they were living in, and that they can do more with their voice. She helped to get them to start a Black Student Union at their campus, and she taught them that, like, especially for her being a white teacher, that not everyone is like that, and that she is ashamed of the narrative, and that she have to understand that not all white people are rich. She calls herself white trash, because like I had to teach her like when I was in college before, and just the way she understands things and the way she gets people to think about stuff has really inspired me to want to do the kind of teaching like that, being socially and culturally aware of what's happening with my students, so that I'm on their level at the same time they can try to reach mine as well. So I would say those are probably some of the people that influence me a lot, that I look up to as educators.
Thank you.
For me, it's not really, I'm like a liberation person, redemption person. I'm always trying to like Black power and get out of somewhere. So I'm always reading like Pedagogy of the Press. I'm looking at Francis Press Wellsing, Dr. Henry Clark. So like a lot of just Black scholars work, because they were all educators, and it just depends on what platform that they got. But like anything like that. I love philosophy. I love Noam Chomsky. I don't know, anyone that can make logical sense in a space of a lot of average intellect people. I love to engage in. So I don't have like any authors specifically, but I'll plug Geneva Smitherman and her Ebonics book, so that people might want to check that out.
I guess for me, working in the space I'm in, there's a couple different places to look. This guy, Eric Thomas, Dr. Eric Thomas, E.T., the hip hop preacher, I kind of grew up in student affairs with him, kind of monitoring and admiring what he was doing at Michigan State University with the Aspire program, which was really around the time when I first started in higher education almost. How do we work with students and inspire students who look like us on predominantly white campuses, was definitely a big inspiration for me. And sort of like that, what Dr. Catherine said, I don't know if there is one or two people that, authors or higher education thought leaders or education thought leaders that I aspire to look for or aspire to be like, but, regionally, I could definitely say I have a number of mentors who are in, different areas, who have made major impacts at the institutions they've been at. I always like Jeffrey Canada's, definitely that one block at a time mentality. I think that was always a big piece for me. Just, you can't do everything at once. You got to do it one block at a time.
And for me, it's kind of similar. I guess Henry Louis Gates Jr. I really like him and the different avenues and information that he shares. And I share that information with my son, just helping us to understand who we are as individuals and the greatness that we have come from, and some of the oppressions that we have experienced as well. And just on a local level, I had the opportunity to meet him when I was an undergrad at John Kerry University. He came and spoke at my school. And on a local level, I would say Elizabeth Clark. She was instrumental in starting a gifted program in the school district where I teach. And I met her as a high school student. So then to fast forward and then be an educator in that program, of course, when I became an educator, she was no longer there, but she was just very, she had a way about herself that encouraged individuals of color, students of color, to set high standards and do not take anything less than what you should have, and really encouraging educators to set those high standards. And again, going back to not defining children by their zip code, because we have a tendency to do that in education, and then that minimize what we expect from them. But giving them the support they need as a whole child, that was something that was essential to her philosophy of education.
I think in part one, we kind of hit on the importance of relationships. And so mentorship and just people to look up to, or even theories and frameworks that we model our practice after, is so important. And so it's encouraging to hear some of the people and some of the work that you all look to for inspiration and even modeling your practice after. What are, so I think inclusive teaching and culturally responsive differentiated instructional strategies, or culturally responsive pedagogy, are two practices that I think are currently being used. One of the culturally responsive pedagogy is a lot older than the inclusive teaching, I believe. But what are some other methods and practices that you all use or support in closing the achievement gap between students of color and white students?
Well, we use UDL, which is Universal Design for Learning. That's the framework. And it emphasizes multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, multiple means of action. And it's not about fixing the child, it's about fixing the lesson, because there's nothing wrong with the child. You have to make sure that you are meeting their needs. So you are front loading so that you can know your who to remove barriers, because you go in under the assumption that these are some possible things that may occur. So instead of trying to have just 50 different individual things, provide a buffet and let the students kind of discover what are their best ways. But also surveying students, surveying families. But UDL really does push that envelope for the educator to fix the lesson, not try to fix the child.
I wanna follow up with that. There are, and I've seen this just from working in higher ed, not necessarily at my institution, but kind of I want to say probably a larger issue. But I think with where we are in society, and there has, I think, objectively been a kind of a codifying of students to a certain extent, where we still see parents, calling professors and offices on behalf of their children, and we're like, hold on, like your child is 20 years old, or even a freshman in college. And so like they have to, at some point they have to learn how to have conversations on their own. And it doesn't mean that they can't consult you, but you should not be calling my office on behalf of your student when I see them on a regular basis, and when they can express maybe some of their concerns to me. And there are exceptions, of course. There are definitely exceptions. But as a rule of thumb, like I don't think that should be happening. And so how do you respond to people who may say, by kind of tailoring the lesson or providing all of these varieties of ways to approach the lesson from, that we are somehow maybe watering down the content or catering to their needs to the point where they're more or less kind of being spoiled or babied, for lack of a better word?
Well, I don't think it's being spoiled or being baby. People have to know what is the best way that they learn. So the only way you discover that is having that opportunity. You can still embed the rigor in those activities and provide those DOK, the depth of knowledge higher levels 3 or 4, but you just do it in a way where the students can experience some success, because that's the whole point of education, right? Where you will experience some type of success. So helping them to understand. So once they have those strategies, because it's also building self-regulation skills. That's the best part of UDL. You have some ownership in this as well. So building those self-regulation skills so that you can have those executive functioning skills and can make and have decision-making skills, or be able to control impulse, or managing your time management skills. So students have to be taught that before they are disseminated or pushed into the world. So I think that people may confuse it with tailoring to someone's individual need, but last time I checked, everybody drives something different. We wear something different. We eat something different. We do what we want as individuals. So why do you have to learn that once you get on the other end? Why can't you learn that before you get into the world and out on your own?
Thank you for fleshing that out more.
And this is somewhat related, but connected to what you were saying. In my dissertation, I coached teachers how to be emotionally supportive. And the research behind why that was what I chose was because young Black boys and young Black children don't know how to label an emotion or identify emotion. And so some children, many, get mad or angry and can't say that they're mad or angry. And so a large part of my coaching was to teach the teacher just to simply tell the child to use your words. And it's really one of the most simple things. And we as adults, we do it to our children all the time when they say something, or we're like, use your words. Like, what are you trying to say? But for young children who are never given a label for an emotion, they just do not know how to express it, to identify it, label it, or any of those things. And so, it's interesting what our children need, but it's also, if you're not taught, you don't know. And it doesn't matter what age you are when you first get taught. Until you are taught, you just do not know. And what we did in this class is hung up on the wall, you know, those like feeling charts. You go to the doctor, they ask you how you feel. So because my kids had very limited language skills, these are all Black boys I'm working with, we put a chart on the wall and the faces of the charts. And these kids had emotions that you didn't think young children had, like worry, like stress, like anxious and things. They were able to point out how they felt. Every morning in circle time, we would say how we felt. And I truly learned that young children feel emotion, ashamed. They feel those things and they know what they are when you tell them what it is. And so some of these practices that teachers don't use is because they don't know that our children are coming to school with deficits in those areas, and that beyond teaching curriculum and content, we have to teach basic things such as how to express how you feel, how to say the screen is too close, too far away, basically how to advocate for yourself as a child, basically is what it becomes. And if you are a really responsive educator, you're responsive to the child, so you're able to know when that child does not know something or that student does not know something. And even like I teach undergraduate students now, and I had a student in my class that's legally blind, and he would be absent. But part of the reason I checked on his attendance, he's legally blind. So like if the weather is bad, if Uber doesn't come, if he doesn't have money, if there's no bus, like he's legally blind, right? So I had to tailor my content to make sure it was always available for him before class. All my students benefited, but honestly that he was legally blind and there was these expectations about attendance. I can't put an expectation on attendance on a child who's legally blind as an adult, right? Because they can't just call somebody to come pick them up. And so to your point, some of these things our kids don't know, some things we need to be aware of, and a lot of things that our children have deficits in. They have so many strengths, but their deficits that they have is what prevent them from being functioning human beings once they do get in the real world.
And you're right. And that's where that social emotional learning is so pivotal. It has to be there. That's the trend. It shouldn't just be a trend. It just needs to be permanent so that our kids will know, and then they can make that transition into adulthood and be able to articulate how they feel and advocate for themselves. That's the whole point of social emotional learning. And we do it even in my virtual classroom. I do a check-in. I'm doing summer school. We do a check-in. How are you feeling today? And they can just slide. In the classroom, we have it where they can slide things, but you can still do it in a virtual setting as well. So we need to be aware. They have to be cognizant of how they feel so that they can push through those feelings and they don't become barriers, because that's what tends to happen. And then you have a shutdown of the student, then you have a shutdown of the learning process. And that's not something that we essentially want.
Those are some of the practices I do in my classroom. The first thing when they enter my reading classroom is a daily check-in. And the first question always, how are you doing today? Every single day, they have to tell me. And that helps me to modify my lesson. Like if we're going to be talking about something sensitive and I have a student whose grandma just passed away, I better change what's going on. I'm very, very aware of it when we go through our civil rights unit, because I want to know how these kids are feeling about things, and especially with people in politics using very racially charged statements. You know, it was interesting to gauge my students to see how they're doing with some of the topics that we're going to be talking about, and allowing them to engage each other. So we model discussion early on in the semester, first semester, so that when we get to our civil rights unit, they are able to discuss things without trying to put each other down. They know that we have established an environment that's going to be conducive to debate and not argument. You know, like they're able to talk with each other, respect others' opinions, try not to talk over one another, don't put each other down, because we have modeled what it's supposed to look like. And now that we've modeled it, now we can have good and legit discussions about race, about politics, about those things that pop up in our literature as we're reading and as they're connecting it to the larger unit at large, and then the preceding unit, and then the unit that comes after. So that's trying to get them to understand like culture through the lens of literature, so that they are prepared for that kind of thing. And like Ms. Karen said, they're using UDL to do that, so they get to choose the kind of project they want to do. They get to choose the kind of things that they want to do reports on. I try to celebrate culture no matter what it looks like where they're at. I mean, my school's in between cows and corn, so like it's nothing but cows and corn surrounding that thing, but it's a distinct culture on its own. And tell them, like, even though you guys are born here, you guys are a distinct culture from what I understand, you know, white culture in California, or what I was raised up in California, or what it looks like 50 miles down the road in Findlay or in Toledo. Like you guys have distinct cultures, and there's a way to look at that culture and think that it's not homogenous. It doesn't look the same throughout the state, doesn't look the same from city to city. So it's using those contexts in order to teach these lessons helps these kids to understand the larger picture of multicultural when they start going into the high school.
I think kind of going back to what Robert said earlier about that coddling, I guess, thought method or thought, the models that you all discuss, and I guess this is a challenge that we have in higher education, is have we also taught students how to, I guess we want to say, how to navigate when they don't, when they aren't in systems that are like that, right? Because higher, again, going back to a lot of different things, higher education is very rigid, very old, very white. It's very, get this is what it is, go forward. And so when I come from a universal design to where, to come into a classroom where I'm strict and straightforward and this is it, where do we get that navigation from? And that's, I think, where we see a lot of the conflict that students have in higher education, because they're conflicted on how to navigate. And a lot of them just, either they just stop and, they freeze, or they plunge through somehow, right? There's that grit that they get to, where you get sick and tired of being sick and tired, right? So you figure out a way through it. going back to some of those designs, higher education has not really adapted it. And they are, depending on the institution and what their goals are, they may not adapt. Now we're forcing that in a lot of different ways now, because if you want to continue to bring students that are of color and students from our communities, you need to make some decisions on how to keep them here and how to teach them the right way. And so we always see that kind of back and forth. I don't like saying coddle, but some tend to want to abuse systems that they've used. And when you find out that that system, it doesn't work in another in another ecosystem, right? Then it's hard for them to learn to navigate. And so I think sometimes we have to also look at what are those external pieces, because we talk a lot about what's happening in the class, but I think that community or that communal piece of education is important as well.
I want to add to what you were saying, Gaddy. I worked with the students that you work with on a daily basis at my university. I was director of community engagement. And what we ultimately ended up doing as a strategy on campus, I don't know if you all do this, but it started out with the LGBTQIA+ community, where they would make like a rainbow sort of sticker. And it was like, this is, if a professor or anyone had it by their door, you knew there was a safe space for you to go. So we started to do that for students of color too. So students of color would know who in the department and who they could go talk to, because these individual folk would have this sticker outside of their door, whether it was a rainbow sticker or the sticker that we chose for our students of color. And it worked really, really good. And I ended up starting a movement where, I don't know how other universities, ours didn't have a student ombudsman. And so we fought and we got a student ombudsman. And in the fight, when we got the student ombudsman, the students asked specifically for who they wanted. So it had to be a person of color, a person that had maybe a different sexual orientation, et cetera, to make sure that the person that they brought in was still who they needed. And so what we ended up doing for the students is creating these places where they could find safe spaces, who would have these things sort of outside their doors, and then giving them a student ombudsman. Because it's like, you can't go to your professor because they're grading you, and you feel repercussions from anybody. You don't know what you can do in those cases. It doesn't work if the student ombudsman is not probably a person of color or a person from a vulnerable population. It probably doesn't work as effectively. But that was some of the practices that we did use to sort of give students of color a space to go. Because you don't know. You just don't know where you can go. You can't navigate it. It's just too large to navigate higher ed. It truly is.
And I think, unfortunately, a lot of institutions are kind of shying away from that kind of thought process. And I think by default, and it's not, I think by default, we've kind of used the label as first gen as the place for a safe place for students, right? Because we assume that you are a first gen student and you're African American or Black or brown, and that's not always the case. That's become a default for a lot of folks in a lot of institutions. So I definitely think like the ombudsman and programs that advocate, you know, I hate plugging my program, TRIO Student Support Services, but you know, programs like TRIO, any other advocacy programs that are there to help students, you know, gain their voice, as well as help them to navigate and develop their own sense of identity in a lot of different areas and ways.
Yeah, great. Just one more thing. Do you guys do like the first year experience courses now? Like they're easy to create on a campus that I was on, 1 credit. And so what we started to do was create these sort of first year experience classes that you can choose the topic on to help retain, especially students coming in of color into the STEM fields. Like, it's just the content is so terrible, they can't handle it. They just can't stay. And so we would have like first year experience classes to talk about STEM from a cultural perspective, like, because it's just it's so abstract in itself. But we found that as a way also to engage students coming in, to retain them, just because of the flexibility and being able to pick what you talk about. And I don't know how most universities are, but I think now students have to take a first year experience class for universities that probably are focusing on retention.
And I kind of get I have the 2-prong approach here, because I've worked at the large 4-year and then I've worked at the 2-year. Your 2 years are more getting away from that FYE kind of mindset. And unfortunately, it's because they had to reduce the number of hours that are required for a degree, an associate's degree or a transfer, because I think they went through an audit a few years ago, I want to say somewhere around 2010, 2011, where they made them start, especially at the community college level, they had to start reducing the number of hours required for a degree. So you went from somewhere around 80 hours down to somewhere in the 60-hour range. So you have this fight now from the student services side and the support services side, where we say we need those things. But on the other side, academia says we don't have time for it, we don't have room for it. And so the fight has to be from the student services side, the fight has always been and continues to be integrated into whatever that is, right? Like you said, integrating it into the STEM systems. Your 4-year institutions will more than likely keep those FYE, FYI initiatives. The 2-year institutions are pushing you through. We got to get you through. You got to get these credit hours completed. And so that's where that's an interesting piece where students of color, when they come to community colleges, sometimes get lost in the sauce because of that. They don't have that FYE class. They don't have that connection point. And that's why those other support systems are extremely important.
Thank you all I think you all really fleshed that out well and talked about a number of different ways. FYEs, for those of you who do not know it, stands for first year experience. So for our viewers who are not higher ed lingo savvy, that's what it stands for.
Hey, we have all the acronyms in higher ed. Come to me.
Oh man. So we know that legislation, as well as district and school policies, practices, and procedures have often caused and or contributed to racial inequities and injustices within education. And so as scholars and practitioners, what should our viewers think about this? And what are tangible ways that our viewers can help to enact change to bring about racial justice and equity within education?
I'll jump in there. Sort of touched on this a little bit last time we met, but the fact that education in itself is just a white system. It's just Black people of color are still being put into it. It's still not becoming a system that is supportive of people of color. And I think the laws that exist allows that to happen. The way that they were written, education is compulsory, like that in itself, right? That the fact that it isn't compulsory, the fact that families don't have the opportunities to homeschool like they would like, the fact that certain policy, the funding models for funding education are just inequitable in itself. If you don't have a lot of property tax in your area, I mean, you're just not gonna have funding for your schools. And so that just creates the biggest problem in itself. That's the worst policy that we have, is how education is funded. It allows everything to just sort of perpetuate itself the way that it is, the lack of resources, lack of services, et cetera. So yeah, I would just sort of throw that in and add it on for those that didn't get to see last week, but just sort of how special education itself as a system is used to sort of segregate kids of color and push kids of color out of mainstream. It's always been ways that states have found to sort of fight against Brown versus Board. States are still fighting against Brown versus Board to this day. Some districts are still succeeding from the state on their education. So I think it's just, are we gonna continue to try to make education a safe space for kids of color? Or are we, as people of color, gonna take our kids out of this space and create our own space for kids? And that is ultimately the challenge in itself, to do so. And it really won't take a lot, because only 7% of the teachers are Black and only about 15% of the kids are Black. So you're not talking about a real huge something that we could do, but it would have to be a collective. We talk about the statistics going down. The statistics for white children are decreasing, and the statistics for Black children are decreasing. And that is what we have to understand. It's not just that white kids are getting pushed out, but Black kids are too getting pushed out. And the Hispanic population is rising at such a fast rate that people like to group kids of color into one, and the Hispanic population is not nearly getting the needs it needs to be met in schools, because there is just no language supports at all for the rate of Latino kids that are growing in our schools. And so we're going to run into another problem later with the Latino children's experiences in schools. So yeah, there's a lot of policies that are really just sort of designed to like fight against what Brown versus Board asked. And we just need to take our 7% and our other 15% and just move them right on into our own system if we could.
I feel like what people can do, for your question, like what can they do and how can they think about this? I think the best thing to do is to educate yourself, man. Like do some research and go do some reading of books, do some watching of like documentaries, and try your best to try to understand what the problem is and how the problem has been systemic for such a long time. And start talking to people in the community. You know, like I would start with church, man. Start talking with people at your church, because you're going to find a lot of people there that are going to have the same kind of sympathies that you are going to have. And talk to people in your community to figure out what you can do to start fixing some of these things. You know, how, like if it's going to be petitioning, you know, to local government, if it's going to be petitioning to local school boards, like problems need to be solved, and you need to be educated in them in order to figure out how to solve them, because the enemy knows what they know, man. The enemy knows their strategies, so you got to know how to play chess with the enemy, and you got to know how to anticipate their moves so you can make the right moves.
Right, and along with that, Michael, with the educate, just elaborate a little bit more on the avocation piece. You know, we're stronger in numbers. So when people have a collective thought and we gather together and then we disseminate out and we put the pressure on the policymakers, that's what we need to do. We need to make sure that when we are voting, that you are voting for people who are going to put in policies that will make changes. And when they do not, you need to hold them accountable. And I think that's where we fall short. We do a lot of talk, but the actionable steps are not there. So I just would encourage people to, just like you said, start maybe some grassroots groups, start meeting, start something online, just somewhere where you can disseminate information to people. And that way people will become more cognizant of what's going on, because people don't know what they don't know. They think they might know, but they might not necessarily know. And that might mean you just pulling somebody to the side and having a conversation with them one-on-one and telling them about your experiences. But we have to put the pressure on the policymakers, because we put these people in place. They say they're going to do things. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Then they need to be held accountable. And then with that being said, run for office. If that's not good enough, you get some people behind you to run for office. But we have to just start to come up with more actionable steps and pushing that information out, because I think that's part of it. We don't know that we know we're stronger in numbers. People have these different conversations in silos, but we need to come together to have this conversation.
And I wanted to say that's part of what you're seeing is just people think about politics at the vote for my governor or my school board or whatever. But what you're talking about is politicking. The strongest entity in public schools is the PTA. Parents have a platform in every school, but people don't know how to politic. And that's what it is. Unfortunately, it's politicking. And it's not just simply voting. You don't have to, people like, I don't participate in politics. Okay, don't vote, but you can join the PTA. Okay. Unfortunately, it's still participating. But if parents do not join the PTA, parents, you're just not going to get anything, because in the schools that are fully funded, not only do those schools get properly funded, those students' parents got social and political capital. So they're going to get what they want if they didn't have the right funding. So as people of color, with students and children of color, if you don't join the PTA for $5, okay, it's $5, maybe 10, like you're not going to have a voice. And what Karen is basically saying is that, like, you have to know everywhere in America is built on politics, and everywhere you can appeal something, you can gather somewhere, and it's a program designed for you to do that. So, but we are not taught how to use that, but white folks know how to use the PTA. I tell you, they know how to use it. And the teachers union, Karen, you ain't talked about it, but teachers, y'all need to use that teachers union out here. Like, come on, talk about what the purpose of the teachers union is, because the police officers will let you know who the police union is. And if the police union is controlling the mayor and the city manager and the police chief, then the teachers need to be controlling the principal, the superintendent, and the chief of the school, or whoever, right? So there are things in place. We have to use them and know the importance of them. And like the unions and the PTA, you start there only. Just there, those two places, you will see a drastic change. But the teachers union, Karen, need to go on and do their thing.
And here's the thing, is that the teachers union has to make the connection with the parents. We have to make the connection with the parents. If there is not a PTO or a PTA, we must encourage them to have one, because they don't listen to us. Policymakers listen to parents. That's who they listen to. I could go down there and testify to a sub-education committee, they nod, and that's it. But when the parents come, or even the students come, that's a different platform, because that is a testimonial. They're not going to necessarily listen to me. So until we realize, and it goes back to what you said, until we realize the power that we actually have, but when we're not cognizant of it, then that's when things are stalemate. But once we realize the power that we have together, stronger in numbers, then that's what will make the difference. And you are absolutely right. Both avenues need to begin to speak to each other. Why are we fighting the same fight separately? We need to work together. Then that way we can just take it over.
Be visible and be heard.
There you go. That's it.
That is. Where do you all see education, the education system within the next 50 years? So 2070, that's scary to say, 2070. Where do you all see the education system in 2070?
I think we're going to move away, and you're seeing it now, because COVID-19 has really given us a glimpse into what it's going to be. The thought of my grandchildren getting on a school bus to go to school is probably not going to it's not going to exist. You're going to look more at the virtual learning environment. You're going to look more at the virtual coaching, virtual teaching. And I think you're going to see an expand to a place that we thought like the Jetsons were when we were kids. You know, you thought you're going to have a video teacher pop up in your school or in your office one day and just talk to you, right? Because I don't think that we will see large gatherings come around too many more times. Unfortunately, I think that's a scarcity, but I think that that's going to be a big piece, is the online learning piece. And it'll be elevated to a place where I don't necessarily know what it looks like, because it's going to look totally different. Because if you look at it now, school looks different than what it was back in January, let alone what will it be like in 50 years. So I definitely think that it's a like you said, it's a scary thing to think 2070. I hope I'm still around. If I am, I'll be around my 80s and 90s. But it will look, I think it'll look a lot more electronic and a lot more, hopefully it will get back to a place where there's some technical learning as well.
I'm going to say that this year is the 66th year since Brown versus Board. So when we're talking about 50 years, we're only 66 years away from Brown versus Board of Education. And look where we are today. What I would say on a positive note, though, is that there are a lot of healthy children at home right now. In the spaces that I'm in, I'm saying that from the perspective of school-induced stress and trauma. So many parents' children don't have stomach aches, don't have headaches, and are not sick physically, mentally. And so I don't know what we will look like in 50 years, but what I do know is that we're going to have a generation of kids who do not have to experience school trauma, which is really, really, really detrimental on a person's social and emotional learning. And so as we are in this virtual space, we have to do something to make sure that even though they're not experiencing those traumas, that they are still not experiencing a different type of trauma in spaces that they can't get out of because they are stuck at home. And so it's sort of like, how do you look at that experience? But I can tell you from a person who's had to deal with it, school-induced trauma for me was a lot less than home trauma. And so I don't know what some of these children would experience, but we are finding in the earlier ages, so our birth to 5 children being a little bit more developed because they're not experiencing some of those school-induced traumas, almost up to birth to 10, really. And so I would hope that we could get to a place where we know that emotional development comes before social development, and you can't learn if you don't have emotional development. But white science will lead you to believe that social is where it's at to learn, and you just can't learn if you're angry and uncomfortable. So I'm hopeful that a lot more learning could take place for some of these children who are not experiencing traumas in schools. But I don't know what that looks like at the home in this time.
I think with so much uncertainty right now, and with the digital divide or digital gap and opportunity gaps, it's difficult to see something positive come out of our educational system. There may be where there's just pockets of different schools versus a collective system. That could be something that might be in the future, just because the direction that how the funding is going when it comes to public schools. So just, I just think that we just need to be more proactive so that we can have a vision that everybody has the opportunity to be successful in our educational system. No matter what color, sexual orientation, it doesn't matter. That everyone, and it can happen, but people have to want it to happen. And that's the thing, because it's designed for the have and the have-nots. Until we really internalize that, until we really articulate that, there won't be many changes, and it will be detrimental to our children of color.
I'm wrestling with this question because I don't know, because like the optimism in me wants to see strides made in the gaps between white and black and minorities. Like it wants to see these gaps closed up, wants to see like success happen there. But then I see schools that are very slow to change, or they finagle the way that the language is written so that their policies reflect what they've been doing for the past 50 years, 66 years, So, but they, they just label it different. And I hope, like my hope is that my son and my children are going to experience something that's going to help enrich them for the world that's going to need their intelligence. At the same time, be sensitive to their experience, on a social emotional level and on a cultural level, and telling them a narrative that is more honest and not some dominant white Anglo-Saxon Protestant like kind of narrative that has been pushed and shoved on everybody else. Like I hope that they're celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day and not Columbus Day when the time comes. I hope that they are celebrating more people of color as they're learning about the founding fathers. Like it's not just these dudes who have these like marble statues. I'm hoping they're learning so much more than the kind of learning that I had to experience. And that's the optimist in me, and the realist in me is going, we have a long way to go before we get there. But we can do it. It can be done. As long as we are pushing for change now, the change can start to see and grow and build to the point where in 50 years we can have this conversation and feel like it is the smaller problem and not the bigger problem.
Sure. I have thoroughly enjoyed chopping it up with you all for part 1 and part 2, and I thank you all again for providing insight and giving our viewers this knowledge and practical steps that they can take to help bring about justice for people of color within the education system. With our final question, what is one thing you wish people knew about race and education?
But the struggle is real, man. It's real for people of color. The pressure is on you, like, and we need leaders. We need people to succeed of color. Like, the education system is built in a way that's supposed to keep you down. Like, it does not favor your culture. It does not favor who you are unless there's something that has been done to change that. The system has been created to keep you in your place. So, like, it's going to be both a hard climb up that mountain, but you can do it. We are examples of that. There are people who have been examples of that, and build the community around you. Get people to buy into you as the individual who is going to be the policy maker, the decision maker, the goal getter, the game changer. At the end of it, it is a rough system, and it's not designed for people from the bottom to rise up, but you can do it.
It is a very difficult system to navigate, but just as Michael articulated, you can do it. It can be done. And we just have to learn how to work together to make sure that these things can be done. These individual conversations that are being had, we need to just make sure that we are working together to bring about the changes that we want for our children today, tomorrow, and in the future, to just be honest. We just have to figure out a way where our voices can be heard more. It's happening. It's 2020. 2020 is perfect vision. It's the opportunity now for us to make sure that we are doing what we need to do to make sure, like I said, our children today, tomorrow, and in the future have an opportunity to be successful in our school system.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You didn't never mute back. So I just want to piggyback with you both. Want to say there are so many successful people of color that come out of the public education system, and to know that it doesn't mean defeat at all whatsoever. My son has a story. I can't wait for him to tell it, but he started on an IEP at 3 years old, 1.5 years old developmentally, and he came off his IEP at 4th grade, so at 9 years old. It's not something that is supposed to follow you if you get the right services and you have the right advocacy and what you need and get the services that you're supposed to be provided. And so all I would say honestly as the parents is to advocate for your kid, fight for your kid. Even though your experience with the education system was horrible, it is. The school space doesn't contend power, take it, is all I would say. In order for me to, my son was suspended at kindergarten, and the only way for him to not get suspended again is that I had to lock the doors with change, like Coach Clark did, Principal Clark on, Lean On Me. And when I did that, and I asked the superintendent to resign 9 in the morning, we had a conversation, it was tense, and the vice principal said, we don't have the services here for her child. Okay, my son started school the day after Labor Day, and it's November, and you suspended him twice. Right? That wasn't happening. My son never got suspended again in that case. And what I had to do as a parent was there was no option. There was no solution. I had to wait for them to get the services they needed, which meant that his behavior wouldn't have been controlled, which the problem still existed. And so because of his father and I basically said that anytime that you want to send him home, call us first. We will come to the school and de-escalate him until you get the proper services, and then he goes back to class, right? So what I'm saying in that story is, as a parent, you have to do what you have to do. That came from a place of privilege, and I understand everybody doesn't get the opportunity to take off from work. So I do respect and understand my privilege in that situation. But however you can do it as a parent and you can advocate for your child, don't ever just accept what a school is telling you at all, because race and education are just mutually exclusive. They don't go together, right? And I'll say one last thing. My son was suspended, like I said, in kindergarten at 5. He had a meltdown and hit another child. They categorize his suspension as fighting. I had to go to the state Department of Education just for them to change it to other. Okay. And the reason why that's important is because if my son transferred to the counties, he would be coming in as a Black boy with a disability with 2 suspensions for fighting. Okay. That's just not a good paperwork. So whatever you have to do to fight for your child in every area, don't even accept the reason for the suspension. Don't accept the reason for the expulsion. Don't accept the reason for the phone call. Like, don't accept any of it if you can as a parent, and believe your child. Most often these children are honest, it is a little bit to it, but believe your child more than what you are believing them, and don't double punish them, because race and education just do not mix. And coming home and being further just dehumanized because of a system that's pushing you out, then your family pushes you out, and then we get the school to prison pipeline. So just advocate for your child, do whatever you have to do. It's the extreme. So what? So did what is it? Is it Joe Clark? Is that who was on Lean On Me? Well, yeah.
Joe Lewis Clark.
That's what you have to do for your children. You got to lock doors. You got to chain them up. You got to bring attention where it's necessary. The superintendent told me I would go to jail. It was a fire hazard. And I told him, but the headline will be on you. So let's meet in the morning. He went without the headline, and I didn't go to jail, right? So you can take it. Take it how you want to, but advocate for your child if your child is not white.
Well, all right. I will say, sort of kind of echoing what everybody else said, you know, the struggle is real. It definitely is. But advocating, like Dr. Catherine said, for your student, but also once you get to the place where you can advocate for yourself. You know, make sure that you're standing in those spaces and making a stand. And the last part is tell your story. You know, I think sometimes we forget that because we forget to go back and tell the story to help those who need to hear it, to help them navigate where they're trying to go. So while we know that there are injustices and we know there are disparities, you know, while we see them and we address them, guess what? I can tell my story of advocacy to empower the next person to come along and hopefully help them push through. And at one point in time, hopefully we'll be past this and we'll be at on a better standing.
Yeah. Well, I thank all 4 of you again for committing this time to shed some light on your experience and your heart and your insight as it pertains to race and education. I trust our viewers have a lot to chew on for the coming weeks and coming months. And I wish you all best wishes over these next months and even coming years as we come out of COVID-19 and how that's disrupted education for better and for worse. But I wish you all continued success. And thank you again for spending this time with our viewers and myself.
Orale.
Thank you.